Chapter 16 of Earthquake Terror. Okay, I can't even get started. Look at my crazy cat. Scruffy. 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 What are you doing? Scruffy. Oh, hey, cutie pie. Okay. Chapter 16, Earthquake Terror. Jonathan woke up 4 hours later in a hospital bed. There was a bottle suspended over his head, and clear fluid dripped from the bottle down a tube and into his left arm. Jonathan stared for a few moments at the bottle and then closed his eyes, remembering. They had kept swimming, he and Moose, until Jonathan was sure each stroke was his last. One more, he told himself time after time. You can't give up after Moose risked his life to save you. One more stroke, one more. Twice he did the dead man's float to rest, and both times he had to force himself to start swimming again. One more stroke. When he absolutely could swim no longer, he raised his head, looking for a floating tree to cling to. Instead, he saw land only a few yards away. One more stroke. One more. Jonathan tried to stand, and his feet touched bottom. Exhausted, he had staggered forward and collapsed on the shore. Jonathan! Jonathan opened his eyes and turned toward the voice. A woman in a white uniform approached his bed. She stuck a thermometer in his mouth and picked up his right wrist and took his pulse. While she removed the thermometer, she said, "How are you feeling?" "Tired. My head hurts." "I should think so. There's a bump the size of a baseball where something hit you." "You're lucky the human body is prepared for emergencies. Have you ever heard of the diving reflex?" Jonathan shook his head. The body's diving reflex allows us to survive in cold water even when we're submerged for long periods of time. The heartbeat slows and the arteries nearest the skin get smaller so that the blood carries oxygen away from your arms and legs and toward your heart and brain. In cold water, the oxygen needs of the tissues are reduced, which extends the possible time of survival. It's really quite remarkable, and the diving reflex is more active in children than in adults. "My dog saved me," Jonathan said. She smiled at him. "I'd better let your parents know you're awake. They're terribly worried about you." "Where are they?" "Your father is in Beaverville. Search parties are looking for your sister and others. He's at the search headquarters. Your mother's downstairs in the recovery room. A young man with a 4-wheel drive vehicle brought her in, and she had surgery on her ankle this morning." What a family, Jonathan thought. "Rest while I call the National Guard emergency line and leave a message for your father. I'll tell the doctor you're awake too. He'll want to check you again, and I'll send word down to your mother, though. I don't imagine she's slept off the anesthetic yet." Jonathan lay still, remembering everything that had happened. He remembered the earthquake, the river flooding the trees that he and Abby clung to as they floated down the ocean singing. Suddenly his eyes flew open. He fumbled for the call button that hung on the headboard and pushed it. The nurse hurried back into the room. "I remember what happened to Abby," he said. "I have to tell someone where to look for her." Minutes later, Jonathan was connected by phone to the National Guard station in the Beaverville High School gym. His father was on the other end of the line. We were each riding on a tree," Jonathan said. "I know we passed Beaverville because I saw the outline of some buildings and what looked like fires. Not too long after that, Abby's tree seemed to quit moving. It was as if she got stuck somehow or floated out of the main current. I kept going, but she didn't." As Jonathan talked, Mr. Palmer looked at a large topographical map of the area. "Hold on a minute," he said, and he turned to repeat Jonathan's words to the National Guardsman who headed the search for Abby. He pointed to a cove on the map. "Right about here," he said. "Fishhead Bay." "Fishhead Bay," the guardsman said. "There's an old pier that sticks out into the river at that point. If Abby floated into the bay, she would be out of the current and would not go any farther downstream." He turned away from the map and began barking orders into a two-way radio, directing a search party to head immediately for Fishhead Bay. "Where's Moose?" Jonathan asked when his father returned to the phone. He's here with me, getting spoiled rotten. The men who found you told everyone how Moose laid on top of you and kept you warm. Your dog's a hero. Everyone's feeding him pieces of donut." Jonathan smiled. "I'll be there as soon as I can," Mr. Palmer said. "Pray for your sister." Jonathan drifted and out of sleep. Once in his dreams, he relived the earthquake and woke up trembling, his hospital gown drenched with sweat. He had no idea how much time had passed. The doctor checked him twice. "You have a concussion," the doctor said, "and hypothermia, but you'll heal. You'll be fine in a few weeks." A nurse came in periodically to get his vital signs. Jonathan slept again. "Room service," a voice beside him said. Jonathan opened his eyes. A nurse stood beside him, holding a tray containing a cup of clear broth, a bowl of red Jell-O, and some vanilla yogurt. "Just like a fancy hotel," she said, "except you don't have to tip me." She pushed a button and the head end of his bed went up. Although he had no appetite, he ate most of what she brought, knowing he needed nourishment to keep his strength up. He thought about Abby, guiltily remembering all the times he had resented having to wait for her. What if Abby was never found? What if she was dead? Jonathan could not imagine life without her. "I did the best I could," Jonathan told himself. "I kept her from being too scared. I tried to save her. I did the best I could for Abby." But he didn't know if his best was good enough. The needle was removed from his arm and the bottle taken away. Jonathan fell asleep. Still sitting up in his dreams, he heard Abby's small voice singing, "Itsy bitsy spider." The telephone on the bedside table rang. Jonathan jerked awake and grabbed the receiver. "Hello?" "They found her," Mr. Palmer's voice boomed into Jonathan's ears. "She seems to be all right. She's being airlifted to the same hospital you're in, and I've requested that you be put in a double room together. I'll get there as soon as I can." 2 hours later, men in white uniforms rolled a gurney into Jonathan's room. The small body under the blanket lay perfectly still. The attendants unbuckled the straps that held the patient in place and lifted her into the hospital bed. Abby's dark hair rested on the white pillowcase. Her eyes were closed. "Abby," Jonathan said, "can you hear me?" Her eyes opened. She turned her head and stared at Jonathan. "Hi, Abby," he said. His arms tingled with excitement. She was alive. She was awake. "We're in the hospital," Jonathan said. "I know. The doctor told me. Where's Mommy?" A voice from the doorway said, "I'm right here." Mrs. Palmer entered the room in a wheelchair, her right foot and lower leg in a cast. She wheeled between the two beds, stood shakily, and leaned forward to kiss Abby. She turned and kissed Jonathan, too. Before she sank back into the wheelchair, "I was so worried about you," she said as she wiped tears of joy from her cheeks. "We were plenty worried, too," Jonathan said. The doctor who had examined Abby in the emergency room arrived. "It's amazing," he said. "She has some cuts and bruises and slight hypothermia, but that's it. We'll keep her for a day or two for observation, but I anticipate no serious problems. You kids were lucky, both of you." A short time later, Mr. Palmer rushed into the room. "You look as if you should be hospitalized too," Mrs. Palmer said, after everyone had briefly explained what happened. "All I need is a hot shower and a good night's sleep," Mr. Palmer replied. "And some clean clothes," Jonathan said. "How did you get here so fast?" Mrs. Palmer asked. I heard many of the roads are still closed." "Some are, but not all. Someone from the Red Cross drove me." "What about Moose?" Jonathan asked. "He's still at the emergency headquarters in the Beavertown High School." "Don't worry about Moose. 6 people offered to take care of him until we get back for him. He's getting so much attention he probably won't want to go home with us." "I'm hungry," Abby said. "The nurse will bring you some hot soup soon," Mrs. Palmer said. "I heard her order it." "I don't want soup," Abby said. "Jonathan promised I could have a chocolate cupcake and 3 pineapple milkshakes." "Oh," Mrs. Palmer raised her eyebrows. "Soup first," Mr. Palmer said firmly, "and then cupcakes," Abby said. "Jonathan said I can lick the wrapper." Jonathan grinned. He was actually looking forward to those 6 games of Go Fish. The end. Now, boys and girls, don't forget to take the AR test. And here is the number 13756.